Hi again. In the last video, we touched upon how pedestrians and cyclists are actually a fairly diverse user group. They comprise people who have all sorts of capabilities, use different equipment, have different tolerances for different types of infrastructure. So in this video, we're going to dive a little bit more into what the diversity of needs are that pedestrians and bicyclists have. So we can think about the needs of active transportation users along a bit of a spectrum. On one end, we've got things that are fairly physical and might be addressed in fairly technocratic ways. So safety, for example, we need to build physical infrastructure that is safe. And there's probably going to be some engineering that is involved with that. It's about having rules and standards for how we build places that are going to make sure that walkers and bicyclists are safe as they move around cities. There are also needs around personal capability, and there may be a fairly wide variety of these needs, and so accommodating all of them may require a fairly broad approach to planning for bicycles and pedestrians. There are pedestrians who are really comfortable and capable of walking on a very wide variety of surfaces, including things like stairs and trails. For a lot of people, walking is one of the most versatile modes of transportation because it can, it can be accomplished in a really large variety of places with a large variety of infrastructures. On the other hand, there are users who require, some very specific types of infrastructure, curb ramps, and sidewalks that are relatively smooth and flat to enable the use of wheelchairs. And so there's a pretty wide variety of capabilities that need to be considered. And even among the ranks of cyclists, there are some real differences in terms of, capabilities, who feels comfortable riding on what infrastructure. And so that diversity of capability means that planners need to consider how a really wide range of users will relate to the infrastructure that they're building. And so while safety and capability needs might be considered fairly physical in terms of building places that people can practically use, there are also some really important needs for active users related to the sort of interest and comfort of places that have a bit more to do with the quality of experience and maybe even to do with the design and maintenance of spaces around the street. So not just the sidewalk itself, but to what's to either side. Does this feel like a place that is comfortable for me to use? Even if it's possible for me to be there, do I want to be there? And this is especially important for active users because active users are so uninsulated from their environments, as we discussed in the previous video. And then finally, at what we might say is the extreme of the sort of sociocultural spectrum of needs for active users has to do with acceptance and confidence in using those modes based on sociocultural norms. Is walking and biking something that is accepted by the culture that people are living in? Is it something that signals prestige, or is it something that people perhaps want to avoid because it connotes a sense of lower class? And so shifting the sort of cultural meaning of walking and biking and whether folks want to do this because of the sorts of sociocultural connotations that it has can actually be just as important for encouraging walking and biking as actually planning infrastructure in a physical sense. So next, let's look at some examples of a couple places that might be good for walking or biking and think about, what aspects of these places make them good for walking or biking, and also how there might be some really substantial differences in terms of the needs between walkers and bikers. So in this place, which is in Brooklyn, New York, which I would say is fairly good for walking, we can see that there are fairly diverse land uses. It's a fairly compact land development where I could imagine that you could walk to a lot of places from an apartment if you had one in this part of town. The infrastructure for walking looks reasonably adequate. There are crosswalks, there are sidewalks that are fairly wide. The streets look like they're probably an interesting and fairly welcoming place to walk. There are shop windows to look at. There's activity on the street. There are other pedestrians around. Actually, other walkers tends to be one of the greatest predictors of whether people feel comfortable walking in a place. There are even some street trees. There's a connection to transit. So in terms of both the practicality of walking in this place and also, the user experience, how comfortable or interesting it might be to be in this place, I think that this place is fairly walkable. On the other hand, this probably would not be the greatest place to bike. There's at least 2, if not 3 lanes of traffic. There's no bike lane, so there just isn't a good practical place to bike. Perhaps if you were a really strong cyclist, you might be able to bike in traffic. But I think this demonstrates how, even though it can sometimes be easy to lump modes like walking and biking together, they really, in many ways, have very different infrastructure needs. And so places that are good for walking are sometimes not good for biking, and vice versa. So next, let's look at this place that I would say is probably reasonably good for biking, although maybe it could use some improvements. This is on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, where there is this thing called a cycle track, which is essentially just a fairly well-separated bike lane. So you can see that there's this buffer between the bike lane and traffic. There are a lot of markings, with green paint for the bike lane. And so this provides a fairly protected space where cyclists, even who don't necessarily have a lot of experience or wouldn't consider themselves strong cyclists, might feel okay about cycling. Now, that said, there certainly are some issues here with traffic having, mowed over some of the dividers that don't exactly inspire confidence in the amount of separation. There are issues with mixing of traffic, so you can see the right-hand turn lane here which crosses the cycle track. But nonetheless, the fact that there is a designated space for cyclists on this road might make it a comparatively bikeable place. On the other hand, I'm not sure it would really be the greatest place for walking. There is certainly a sidewalk. It's quite wide, and I believe that there are curb ramps which might provide access for wheelchairs at the intersections. That said, there's not a lot going on to either side. There's this big parking lot. It's kind of a bland, boring space. It feels a little vast, honestly. It's not really a particularly human scale space. I think that I, might not really enjoy walking in this place as much as I would in this Brooklyn example, where there's just a lot more sort of pedestrian activity and the space feels a little bit more human scale. So you can see how the needs associated with being a bicyclist in some cases might be quite different than for walkers. At the end of the day, bicyclists are, at least compared to walkers, relatively fast-moving vehicles. They need infrastructures that accommodate this movement, but at the same time protect them from cars. And that can sometimes end up creating street designs that are actually a bit wider and offer, less of an intimate environment for pedestrians. And so in some cases, designing for bicycles and pedestrians can end up even being a little bit of a conflict.